for being here today. I'm one of the people that drove to be here, but it always makes me excited to be here. So, after Evan McBride's shameless plug of Clark, he's always been, but objectively, very passionate about Clark. But for me as a lawyer, and now Chief Legal Counsel for a private equity fund, we constantly look for places and businesses to invest in the Philippines. And based on my experience as well from the private and public sector, I know that when it comes to anything, like where you put money, the types of decision you make, a lot of it really depends on the leadership and the vision of that leadership. So for me as a lawyer, something I always look at would be the history, the background. So what I'm going to talk about is the history, the laws, and leadership that shaped Clark. So first, one thing that I found very interesting, and especially since I just watched All Quiet on the Western Front, did any of you watch that? It won an Oscar. So Richard watched it. So I think that it's very relevant in terms of what I'm going to talk about the history of Clark. So a lot of places in the Philippines, or even across the world, you can just develop it, right? And make it whatever you want it to be, like a city, central business district. But very few places have a rich history. And Clark is one of those special places that has a rich history. So there used to be what we call a pre-Clark era, where before this was even known as Clark, this already existed. And it already played a big role in terms of military operations. So what you see in this picture is in 1899, which was after the Philippines became independent from Spain, but became a US colony. So as you can see, even before this area was called Clark, in 1999, this photo, you see a US Army Field Artillery unit in Angeles City, in Pampanga. It's also in this area. And before this was Clark, it was actually called Fort Stotzenburg. So, any of you here, did you know about that? Have you heard of Fort Stotzenburg?
Yes.
Yes? Oh, yes, of course, architecture. He's a history buff, and I would say also a nerd. But this was established back in 1902 and named after Colonel John Stotzenburg, the man you see in this photo. And what made him special is that he was a war hero. He passed away in 1899 in a battle in Bulacan province, so not so far from here. But in 1917, this eastern portion of Fort Stotzenburg, which is what you see in this photo, became an airfield. And then 2 years after that, in 1919, it was named Clark Airfield. And this was named after this man here, Major Harold Clark. So that's why we call this place Clark. And Major Harold Clark was special as a pilot. He was born in the United States in Minnesota, but also lived in Manila. But he was the first airfield pilot to fly through Hawaii, and he passed away in Hawaii, in one of the islands, while flying an innovative inter-island flight. So I guess that really made him special as an airfield pilot, which is why Clark Airfield was named after him. But as you can see, this was very strategic for military operations, that when we were occupied by the Japanese took over Clark as well. So in terms of leadership, Clark itself changed hands several times during the different occupations of other countries. So what you see here is a photo from 1944, where Clark Airfield pilots consisted of members of the Japanese Imperial Forces during World War II. And on this side, you will see in 1945, the Americans bombed the hangars here in Clark in order to destroy Japanese military planes. So that's what you see in this other photo here, right? And as you can see in this date, 1947, this was after we became independent from the United States in 1945. 2 years after our independence from the US and the Philippines signed the first base agreement. And this is what integrated Clark Airfield and Fort Stotzenburg into one Clark Air Base. And just to give you the significance of this, this was the largest airfield outside of the United States. And I included this picture from 1952 because this was the first Clark Air Base exchange. And for those of you who love duty-free, and maybe for Filipinos here like me, did you grow up coming here just to go shopping?
Correct.
Yeah, so I used to do that. Like we'd line up our cars, get all the permits just to get in, and this is the only, one of the few places where we can get Hershey's as chocolate, so that's probably real chocolate.
Yes.
Because other than that, there was chocolate. So PX, yes, correct. So this is the precedent of that. The base exchange is where the airfield pilots would buy their shoes, stuff from the US. And eventually for us Filipinos, it's where we would also buy imported items from the US. But as you can see from this picture, there was already a lot of development as far back as 1952. And as the largest airfield outside of the US, this was a crucial place where the US conducted conflict operations with Korea and Vietnam. So as you can see here, at some point in 1965, they even had trailer parks established as transit houses for US military during the Vietnam War. And here in 1973, this is a photo of a C-141 which arrived in Clark from Hanoi during operations, what they called Operation Homecoming, when they ended the Vietnam War. 1979 was another significant date for Clark because this was after they amended the military base agreement, and the command of Clark and other American bases was turned over to the Philippine government. But the Philippines still maintained US here to have them use this as a base. So it was only the command and operation of Clark that was transferred. But in 1991, there was already a complete transfer of Clark and other military bases to the Philippine government. So that's when we really saw a departure of the military forces from Clark Air Base and the other bases. And so from there, we're gonna look at the laws that literally shaped Clark. So after the Americans left in 1992, Republic Act 7227, or the Bases Conversion and Development Act, was what converted American bases to alternative productive uses. And this is also the law that created BCDA. BCDA was the agency, the government agency tasked to implement the conversion of military bases, which is why they're also crucial when it came to what we now see as Bonifacio Global City. And a year after 1993, there was a presidential proclamation under Fidel Ramos that created the Clark Special Economic Zone to be governed by the BCDA. And this is, in this table, I'm sorry it's not very clear, but this is where you see the size of Clark Special Economic Zone. And this was lifted from the presidential proclamation. As you can see, you have Clark Air Base proper, which is what was Fort Stotzenburg, Clark Airfield, around 4,440 hectares total. But here you also see the other military base reserve lands that reverted back to the government, that became part of this special economic zone. And it's an impressively huge 28,000 plus hectares. And in 1996, another presidential proclamation was passed that included the Sacobia area, which is Banban, Tarlac, and Mabalacat, Pampanga. An additional 5,000 hectares was added to the Clark Special Economic Zone to have a total of over 33,000 hectares. And you see in this map that when you talk about Clark, it spans not only Pampanga but also Tarlac. And finally, in 2007, another law, Republic Act 9400, was passed, which declared Clark Air Base proper to be a Freeport zone. So, I remember recently we had a meeting with BSP Governor Medalla, and he said, the Philippines loves acronyms. He even said, create law, the acronym CREATE was thought about first before they thought of how to justify that acronym. Asek Marie is nodding her head. But, so I'm just saying this because you might start getting confused with all the acronyms. You have CFEZ, and then you have CFZ, Clark Freeport Zone. But these differences used to be very important because CFZ made Clark a separate customs territory with its own incentives and duty-free importation. But just to give us something to simplify these acronyms, there's an acronym called CFEZ. And this is usually the collective term used to refer to Clark Special Economic Zone and Clark Freeport Zone. But in 2018, the BCDA and CDC grouped 4 developments under Clark Freeport Zone, Clark Global City, which is where we are right now, and Clark International Airport and New Clark City into one branding. So they called all those 4 areas as districts. And they were covered under one branding, Clark, it works, like a dream. And President Eileen, I can imagine former Chairman Greg thinking about this because he's a very savvy and brilliant marketing guy. So this is their logo for that common branding. But to me, also as a lawyer, one of the visions I saw from the government was really something that related to the Philippines' challenge when it comes to being very disaster risk prone. So in 2020, under President Duterte, Executive Order 119 was issued, which established a national government administrative center in New Clark City. And if you look at this EO very closely, you see in the whereas clauses, I'm highlighting 3 important sentences here. One is that it recognizes that in NCR, there are several coastal communities, particularly in NCR, that are very vulnerable to subsidence, rising sea levels, and increased risk of floods due to climate change. It also mentions that NCR, where the seat of the national government is located, is exposed to the threat of a catastrophic earthquake. And finally, because of all of these, it mandated the establishment of a backup government center outside the NCR here in New Clark City. So this location is the only place in the Philippines that has a redundancy for the national government. So for me, this is one of the things that also formed Clark into an image of not just a place where you can have business, but also one of the few or the only place in the Philippines that has that alternative national government center. And a lot of the government offices were also mandated to have satellite offices here. But to me, now that we're talking about leadership, all of those laws really boil down to who do we have to deal with as investors. And here, when I was talking about all the land area, I tried to simplify it into a diagram. And this is where you see BCDA as the government agency that supervises and leads the whole of this CFEZ, Clark, Freeport, and Special Economic Zone. But in terms of the day-to-day, when we have to get permits, it's the CDC that deals with the day-to-day management. And in 1994, SEAC was also incorporated as a subsidiary that is now a subsidiary under BCDA, where SEAC was tasked especially to manage and operate the Clark Civil Aviation Complex. And this has a land area of about 2,367 hectares. And as a complex, this is one of the largest complex developments in the Philippines. And inside this complex is West Aero Park, about 3.5 hectares, where we are now having this forum. So just want you to have a visual idea of, who is in charge here. And she's sitting right here. But, when we look at this, it's actually, of course, the institutional leadership that's created by laws. But what really matters would be the people behind those institutions, because those are the real leaders. And one of the things that we look at as investors would be, who are really the people behind the areas where we will invest in? And I would say objectively for me, like, something that makes us very optimistic would be the quality of the leaders that we have here right now. So at BCDA, as chairman, we have no other than the former Secretary of National Defense, Secretary Delphine Lorenzana, as the new chairman of BCDA. And as president, we have the first female president and CEO of BCDA, Ms. Eileen Zoza. So Ms. Eileen, I'm very excited to hear from her. But she is not only the first female BCDA president, but she brings over 20 years of experience in government, including from the legislative department. So very excited to hear what you're going to say, President Eileen. And it really makes us very optimistic to know that it's someone who has also served previously as vice president and even involved in operations in BCDA, now running BCDA. And for CDC, we also have a first female president, and this is President Agnes de Vanadera, who was also the former first female Solicitor General of the Philippines, former Government Corporate Counsel, and former Acting Secretary of the Department of Justice. And I guess a lot of people don't know this, but she was also former mayor of Sampaloc, Quezon Province for 10 years. So that, to me, is a good sign that she will not only have a good head in terms of legal, regulatory, but also in terms of executive experience to manage, an area like a city that needs to be developed. And also, by the way, we invited her to speak here. Rebecca, Richard, they invited President Agnes to be here today. Sorry. But CDC also held like another forum on solar panels on this same day. So there was a conflict in her schedule. So we hope to have her next time. And finally, in terms of leadership, we now have a new president and CEO for SEAC. And he was a former Senior Vice President for BCDA, Joshua Jake Biggang. So again, this is a good sign for us because he's someone who very much knows the place, the whole of Clark, and has had experience not only in managing Clark, but he was very instrumental. He led the expansion of the new terminal. And this expansion of the new terminal for Clark International Airport was done in record time and was actually considered a template for how to develop under the Build, Build, Build program of President Duterte. So that's the leadership, and for us as well as for investors, one of the things we look at when we look at a place would be, what is the vision for that place? And as private sector investors, you can only do so much, right? Within your own confines of your business. So the leadership of that area matters a lot as to whether your business can thrive. One thing that we look at here would be the vision of Clark. CDC has expressed that vision, wherein by 2030 they want Clark to be a modern, sustainable aerotropolis. And their mission is to transform Clark into a premier business and tourism destination to become a catalyst of growth and nation building. So I will end with a quote. And to me, I didn't coordinate with Evan on this, but so when I saw him ending on a quote, I was like, he stole my idea without even knowing it. But right now, as Chief Legal Counsel and Director for a private equity fund, we know this. Capital is abundant. Capital all over the world. We have our partner here in West Aero Park is a U.S. private equity fund, Carval, from the U.S. They have a lot of capital to deploy, and there are several other funds that have a lot of capital as well. And we just have to make them believe in the Philippines. And vision is one of the things that's very important for investors to see. So capital isn't scarce, vision is. And we're very happy that we found that vision here in Clark. So thank you, and I will hand